History is filled with leaders remembered for their glory, their wisdom, or their conquests. But then there are those remembered for something much darker: fear. And few names in history inspire as much fear as Vlad the Impaler. We're not talking about the vampire legend, but the real man, the Prince of Wallachia, whose actions were so shocking they horrified even his most battle-hardened enemies. So, who was this man? And what did he do to earn such a terrifying reputation? Born in the early 15th century, Vlad III, Dracula ruled a small but strategic region, caught between two massive powers, the Kingdom of Hungary and the expanding Ottoman Empire. It was a brutal time to be a ruler. Betrayal was common, and survival often demanded extreme measures. Vlad learned this lesson the hard way. As a young boy, he and his brother were held as political hostages by the Ottoman Sultan. He witnessed the empire's power and its cruelty firsthand, an experience that would shape him for the rest of his life. When he finally claimed the throne of Wallachia, he faced enemies from all sides. Internally, the local nobles, the boyars, were constantly plotting against him. They had betrayed and even murdered his father and older brother. Vlad's response was swift and merciless. According to one famous story, on Easter Sunday, he invited the boyars and their families to a grand feast. After they had eaten and drunk, he had them all arrested. The older ones were impaled on the spot. The younger, able-bodied ones were forced to march 50 miles to build a fortress, a project from which very few returned alive. With this single, horrifying act, he crushed the internal opposition and sent a clear message. Loyalty was not optional, but it was his war against the colossal Ottoman Empire that truly cemented his terrifying legacy. Outnumbered and outgunned, Vlad knew he couldn't win a conventional war against Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. So he turned to psychological warfare. He waged a campaign of terror, using guerrilla tactics, surprise night attacks, and poisoning wells to demoralize the massive Ottoman army. His goal wasn't just to kill soldiers, it was to break their spirit, to make them fear every shadow and question their advance. The most infamous example of his methods occurred in 1462, as the Sultan's army advanced on Vlad's capital. They came across a truly ghastly sight. Outside the city of Targovik, Vlad had created what is now known as the Forest of the Impaled. There, on thousands of stakes, were the decomposing bodies of some 20,000 captured Ottoman soldiers and collaborators. The sight and smell were so overpowering, so utterly horrific, that even Sultan Mehmed, a man who had seen countless battles, was reportedly stunned into retreat. He acknowledged that he could not win a land from a man who did such things. It wasn't a military defeat, it was a psychological one. Vlad had turned the landscape itself into a monument of terror. So, was Vlad the Impaler a monster? To his enemies and to the boyars who defied him, he was the definition of evil. But in Romania, many see him differently. They see a national hero, a ruthless but effective defender of his homeland against a seemingly unstoppable foreign invasion. He used fear as a weapon because it was the only weapon that could level the playing field. His methods were undeniably brutal, but in the violent world he inhabited, they worked. He secured his rule and, for a time, held back one of the most powerful empires on earth. The story of Vlad the Impaler is a chilling reminder that history is rarely black and white. It's a complex tapestry where heroes can be tyrants, and survival can demand a terrible price. Imagine a world caught between two titans in the 15th century. That was Eastern Europe. To the south, the mighty Ottoman Empire was a rising force, swallowing up everything in its path. To the north, a fractured Christian Europe looked on, often too divided to act, and squeezed right in the middle was a tiny principality called Wallachia. This was a land living on a knife's edge, constantly forced to choose between two powerful masters. It was a place where survival was a daily struggle, and independence seemed like an impossible dream. Into this powder keg stepped a prince who would become a legend. His name was Vlad III, but history would remember him by a much more fearsome title. He grew up not in a palace, but as a political hostage within the very heart of the Ottoman court. There, he learned the ways of his enemies firsthand, their strategies, their strengths, and their weaknesses. This harsh upbringing didn't break him. It forged him into a ruler of iron will, with a single, burning ambition: to free Wallachia from the grip of empires and secure its independence. no matter the cost. When Vlad finally took the throne, he inherited a kingdom plagued by internal strife. The local nobles, the bourgeois, were corrupt and often sided with whichever foreign power offered them the most wealth and influence. They saw Wallachia not as a nation to be defended, but as a chessboard for their own personal gain. Vlad knew he couldn't fight a war on two fronts. Before he could face the Ottomans, he had to secure his home, and he did so with brutal efficiency. Legend tells of an Easter feast where Vlad invited hundreds of these treacherous boys. He winned them and dined them, and then he asked them a simple question. How many rulers had they seen in their lifetime? As they boasted of outliving king after king, Vlad's trap sprung. He accused them of being the source of Wallachia's instability. The older nobles were executed on the spot, their bodies displayed as a grim warning. The younger, stronger ones were marched to the ruins of an old fortress and forced to rebuild it with their bare hands. It was a terrifying message, but it was clear. Loyalty to Wallachia was no longer optional. With his domestic power consolidated, Vlad turned his gaze south, toward the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, the same man who had conquered Constantinople. For a time, Vlad paid the required tribute to the Ottomans, biding his time, building his strength. But the day came when he was ready to defy the empire. When Ottoman envoys arrived to collect their payment, they refused to remove their turbans in Vlad's presence, citing religious custom. Vlad, seeing this as a sign of disrespect, had their turbans permanently nailed to their heads. The message was sent. War was inevitable. What followed was a campaign of sheer audacity. Vlad knew he couldn't defeat the massive Ottoman army in a pitched battle. His forces were hopelessly outnumbered. So, he turned Wallachia itself into a weapon. He adopted a scorched earth policy, burning villages and poisoning wells, leaving nothing for the invading army to live on. He perfected the art of guerrilla warfare, launching lightning-fast raids on the Ottoman camps, striking fear and chaos into the hearts of the Sultan's soldiers. He was a phantom in the night, a terror that could strike anywhere, at any time. His most legendary and chilling tactic came to be known as the Forest of the Impaled. After one major victory, Vlad had thousands of captured Ottoman soldiers and their collaborators executed in his signature, gruesome fashion. He created a terrifying landscape of stakes upon which his enemies were displayed, a horrifying spectacle designed to break the morale of the advancing army. When Sultan Mehmed himself arrived and saw this ghastly forest, even he, the conqueror of cities, was reportedly shaken to his core and forced to retreat. Vlad's brutal methods made him a monster in the eyes of his enemies, but to many of his own people, he was a savior. He was the protector who stood up to an unstoppable empire when no one else would. He was the symbol of fierce independence, a leader who was willing to sacrifice everything, including his own humanity, for the freedom of his homeland. His story is a dark and complex one, a reminder that in the desperate struggle for survival, the line between a hero and a villain can become terrifyingly thin. His legacy, etched in both blood and bravery, continues to fascinate and horrify us. Forget everything you think you know about Dracula. Before the vampire myth, there was a man, a prince, named Vlad III. And no, he wasn't born a monster. He was born into a world where survival was a constant, bloody battle. This is the story of how a young prince became the feared Vlad the Impaler. Imagine being a child, not playing in a safe backyard, but navigating the treacherous courts of Eastern Europe in the 15th century. Vlad's world was a chessboard of shifting alliances and brutal betrayals. His own father, Vlad Dracula, was part of a secret order of knights, the Order of the Dragon, sworn to defend Christianity against the expanding Ottoman Empire. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was a life-or-death struggle. For the young Vlad, power wasn't a luxury. It was the only thing that stood between his family and annihilation. Weakness meant death. The ultimate betrayal came not from an enemy, but from his own allies. At just 13, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were handed over to the Ottoman Sultan as political hostages. Think about that for a moment. They were pawns in a terrifying political game, living in the heart of their enemy's empire. For years, Vlad lived under the shadow of the Sultan's sword, learning the hard way that mercy was a weakness and cruelty was a tool of power. He saw firsthand the brutal efficiency of the Ottoman military and their methods of control, especially one particularly gruesome technique: impalement. While he was a hostage, his family back home was torn apart. His father was assassinated. and his older brother was blinded with hot iron stakes and buried alive by treacherous nobles, the boyars of Wallachia. When Vlad finally returned to claim his throne, he wasn't just a prince seeking power. He was a man fueled by years of rage and a burning desire for revenge. He inherited a kingdom riddled with corruption and disloyalty. The boyars who had murdered his family now smiled to his face, expecting him to be a weak, controllably puppet. They were about to learn a terrible lesson. This is where the legend of the Impaler begins. To solidify his rule and purge the traitors, Vlad used the very methods he had learned from his captors. His justice was swift, public, and horrific. He famously invited hundreds of boyars to a feast, and after they had eaten and drank, he had them all impaled on stakes outside his castle. It was a message, written in blood, to anyone who dared to challenge him. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated, political terror. He used fear as a weapon to forge a chaotic land into a unified, disciplined nation, strong enough to stand against the might of the Ottoman Empire. Was he a monster? To his enemies, absolutely. But to his people, he was a protector. A harsh but just ruler who brought order and defended their homes from invasion. He was a complex figure, forged in the fires of betrayal and war. His story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the line between a hero and a villain is drawn by those who survive to tell the tale. Ever heard of Dracula? Not the vampire, but the real man. Vlad the Prince of Wallachia. His story is darker and more fascinating than any fiction. To understand the man who would become known as the Impaler, we have to go back to his childhood. Imagine being a young prince, not in your father's grand castle, but in a foreign land, a gilded cage. This was Vlad's reality. As a boy, he and his younger brother Radu were sent to the Ottoman Empire as political hostages. Now, when we hear the word hostage, we picture grim dungeons and chains. But for royal children in the 5th-10th century, it was a bit different. This was a common practice to ensure a ruler's loyalty. Vlad and Radu lived at the Ottoman court, receiving an education fit for princes. They studied logic, the Quran, Turkish and Persian literature, and were trained in the arts of war. They were treated well, almost like guests, but the truth was undeniable. They were prisoners. Every move was watched. Every word was noted. The gilded cage was still a cage. For Vlad, this experience was a forge. He was surrounded by the immense power and sophisticated machinery of the Ottoman state. He saw firsthand its military might, its complex bureaucracy, and its ruthless efficiency. He learned the Turkish language and customs, understanding his captors from the inside out. But more than that, he learned discipline, the rigid structure of the Ottoman court, the constant observation. It sharpened his mind and hardened his resolve. He wasn't just learning from books, he was learning the psychology of power. His brother, Radu, adapted differently. He was handsome, charming, and eventually became a favorite of Sultan Murad II's son, the future Mehmed the Conqueror. Radu embraced the culture and even converted to Islam, finding a place for himself within the empire. But Vlad was different. He was proud, defiant, and resentful. He saw the luxury, but he felt the chains. This feeling of being a pawn in a larger game, of his homeland's fate being decided by a foreign power, planted a seed of bitterness that would grow for years. The most crucial lesson Vlad learned, however, was not one of academics or courtly manners. It was a lesson in cruelty. The Ottomans had a very specific, very brutal method for dealing with rebellion and dissent: impalement. It was a slow, agonizing, and public death, designed not just to punish the victim, but to terrorize anyone who witnessed it. Young Vlad would have seen this punishment meted out. He would have seen the stakes lining the roads, a forest of the dead, serving as a grotesque warning. Imagine the psychological impact of that on a young, captive prince. He saw fear used as a weapon, pain as a political tool, and public spectacle as a means of control. He didn't just witness it. He studied Italiano. He absorbed the terrifying logic behind it. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated. The Ottomans were teaching him how to maintain power, how to crush opposition, and how to make an entire population tremble with a single, horrifying image. These years as a hostage defined the man he would become. The discipline, the resentment, the fear it, all simmered beneath the surface. And most importantly, the brutal lesson of the impaling stake was etched into his memory. He didn't just learn obedience, he learned how to demand it. When he finally returned to his homeland of Wallachia to claim his throne, he didn't forget what he saw. In fact, he perfected it. The boy who was a prisoner of the Ottomans would grow up to use their own terrifying methods against them, turning the weapon of fear into his personal signature. The lessons learned in that gilded cage would echo through history, earning him the terrifying name that we all remember. In the heart of the 15th century, amidst the clashing of steel and the constant struggle for power, a young prince was learning a dark and brutal lesson. This wasn't a lesson from a dusty old book or a wise tutor. It was taught in the blood-soaked earth of the Ottoman court, where Vlad III, later known as Vlad the Impaler, was a political hostage. His classroom was the execution ground. Day after day, he was forced to watch as the Sultan's justice was meted out in the most gruesome ways imaginable. He saw rebels, criminals, and enemies of the state meet their end. But Vlad saw more than just death. He saw the faces of the crowd. He saw fear, raw, primal fear. He watched how a single, brutal display could silence 1,000 dissenting voices. He saw how the memory of a horrific execution could linger in a town long after the soldiers had left, doing the work of an occupying army without costing a single coin or life. This was a revelation. While other rulers built their power on gold, alliances, and massive armies, Vlad saw a different path. He understood that terror was a weapon, more potent and far-reaching than any sword or cannon. It was a psychological force that could break the will of a nation, turn allies against each other, and make a small force seem like an unstoppable legion. These weren't just morbid observations of a captive boy. They were the foundational principles of his future reign. When Vlad finally returned to his homeland of Wallachia, he brought these lessons with him. Wallachia was a small principality, constantly squeezed between two massive, hungry empires. The Kingdom of Hungary and the ever-expanding Ottoman Empire. It was a land of chaos, betrayal, and constant warfare. The local nobles, the boyars, were treacherous, often selling their loyalty to the highest bidder. Vlad knew he couldn't rule through conventional means. He didn't have the manpower or the wealth to compete, so he unleashed the one weapon he had mastered: fear. His methods were shockingly direct and theatrical. He didn't just execute his enemies, he made a spectacle of their demise. His infamous method, impalement, was chosen for its psychological impact. It was a slow, agonizing death, designed to be witnessed. He would create entire forests of impaled bodies along the borders of his territory. Imagine being an invading soldier, marching for days, only to arrive and see thousands of your comrades displayed in this horrific manner. The message was clear and terrifying. This is what awaits you. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. This strategy demoralized entire armies before a single battle was fought. Word of his cruelty spread like wildfire, and the legend of Dracula, the dragon, began to take shape. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated psychological warfare. When Turkish envoys came to his court and refused to remove their turbans as a sign of respect, Vlad reportedly had their turbans nailed to their heads. This sent a chilling message back to the Sultan. Your customs mean nothing here, and your authority ends at my border. He used terror to unify his own land as well. The disloyal boyars who had plagued his father and brother were invited to a grand feast. In the middle of the celebration, he had them all seized and impaled. With one brutal act, he eliminated the internal threat and sent a message to any who would dare challenge him. He replaced the unpredictable web of alliances and betrayals with a single, unshakable, constant, absolute terror of the prince. By turning fear into his primary instrument of statecraft, Vlad the Impaler managed to hold his own against overwhelming odds. He showed the world that the battlefield is not just a physical space, but a mental one. He proved that a ruler's greatest asset might not be the size of his army, but the depth of the fear he can instill in his enemies. His legacy is a dark and complex one, a chilling testament to the power of a single, horrifying idea learned in the shadow of an executioner's block. It is a story that reminds us how one person's understanding of So, you think you know the story of Dracula? Forget the fangs, the bats, and the spooky castles for a moment. The real story is far more intense, and it all begins with a prince returning to a kingdom on the brink of collapse. This is the story of Vlad III, but you probably know him by a more terrifying name. Vlad the Impaler. Imagine coming home after years in exile, only to find your homeland, Wallachia, a complete mess. It's the mid-15th century, and this small but strategic region is caught in a brutal tug-of-war between the mighty Ottoman Empire to the south and the powerful Kingdom of Hungary to the north. It's like being stuck between a rock and a hard place. But the rock and the hard place are two of the biggest military forces in the world. For Vlad, this wasn't just a political problem. It was personal. His father and older brother had been betrayed and brutally murdered by their own nobles. These were the wealthy landowners who were supposed to be loyal to the throne, but they were infamous for switching allegiances faster than you can change a channel. They'd sell out their own prince for a bag of gold or a promise of more power from a foreign king. The country was in chaos. The treasury was empty, trade routes were plagued by bandits, and the people lived in constant fear not of some supernatural monster, but of the very real threats of invasion and betrayal from within. Vlad knew he couldn't rule like his predecessors. Playing nice hadn't worked. Diplomacy was a joke when dealing with treacherous nobles and expansionist empires. He needed a different approach, something that would send a clear and unmistakable message. He decided that if his people were going to live in fear, it would be a fear that united them, a fear directed by him. He would use terror as a tool, not of oppression for its own sake, but of order. He believed that only through absolute unquestioning authority could Wallachia be forged into a nation strong enough to survive. His first target, the corrupt boy. The stories say he invited hundreds of them to a grand feast. As they ate and drank, celebrating what they thought was a new, naive prince they could easily manipulate, Vlad sprung his trap. He asked them how many rulers they had lived under. The older nobles boasted of outliving dozens of princes. That was their last boast. Vlad had them all seized. According to the legends, the older ones were impaled on stakes outside the city walls, a gruesome warning to any who would dare challenge his rule. The younger able-bodied ones were marched off to rebuild a ruined fortress, working until they dropped. This was the beginning of Vlad's reign of terror. He didn't just punish the elite. He went after anyone he deemed a threat to social order: thieves, lazy workers, dishonest merchants. The punishment was almost always the same: impalement. It was a horrific, slow, and public way to die, designed for maximum psychological impact. The sight of forests of impaled bodies was meant to terrify not just his own subjects into obedience, but also his external enemies, and it worked. Stories of his brutality spread like wildfire. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who had taken Constantinople, sent an army to deal with this defiant prince. But when the Ottoman soldiers marched into Wallachia, they were met with a sight so horrifying it broke their morale. A vast field, miles wide, filled with the decaying, impaled bodies of thousands of captured soldiers. This forest of the impaled was a psychological weapon of mass destruction. Even the battle-hardened Ottoman army was shaken. Vlad's methods were undeniably brutal, savage even by the standards of his time. But too many Wallachians. It was a hero. He brought stability. He stamped out corruption. He defended their homeland against overwhelming odds. He was the harsh medicine the kingdom needed to survive. So, was he a monster or a savior? A tyrant or a patriot? The truth, as it often is complicated. He was a product of a violent time. A ruler who decided that the only way to fight fire was with the terrifying inferno of his own making. What do you think? Were his actions justified for the sake of his nation's survival? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this dive into the dark side of history fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that you won't find in your average textbook. Thanks for watching.